All right, welcome to another exciting edition of Victory Never Sleeps. Tonight we are going to talk about Lord Forseti, and he's going to finish our initial run on gods. So Svan and I will be back in the next few weeks to talk about goddesses, but tonight we're going to talk Forseti. Notes at the top of the program. If you guys want to, we are simultaneously broadcasting on YouTube, Entropy, VK, and Twitter, and Odyssey. We're also, you can download the podcast version of this, the audio version of this on Friday on Spotify. If you want to participate in super chats, get your questions or your comments to the front of the line, or if you just want to throw some dollars at us, which is always much appreciated, please join us on Entropy. That's a good way to do that. Checking in on some projects. We've got working on getting Phrasehoff and making that happen. In order to do that, we need to pay off Njordshoff first. Doing pretty well on that. We're making a lot of progress. Currently, if every member of the AFA were to donate $102, we'd be there at having Njordshoff paid off and ready to start on Phrasehoff. Phrasehoff is the Hoff that we are going to put in eastern Ohio, or on a very off chance, perhaps very far western Pennsylvania, but in that part of the country. And we got that going on. We also are currently doing stuff at Sigerheim to make Sigerheim happen better. It looks like we're going to have 2, possibly 3 folks could be living out at Sigerheim this time next month, which is very exciting. Those aren't going to be in super permanent structures at that point, but we're moving forward on it. Just had an expedition out there this last weekend to take some measurements and to talk to a septic guy about some things. So we are well in the swing of that. Been talking to, or trying to get in touch with, some lawyers to talk a little bit about ownership rules and getting that structured legally in the right way. So we're definitely moving forward on it. Any of those things you can donate to on our website at runestone.org, or feel free to donate on this program. We'll make sure they goes to a good cause. That's all I can think of on the top of my head that we got going on right now. Svan, if you would tell these folks, assuming that our fans know nothing about Forseti, what do they need to know?
In Asatru, Forseti is our god of law. He is our Ausa, or Aus of law. He is the divine adjudicator, if you will, the internal adjudicator. Sometimes I think there's some confusion there with Tyr, but we'll go over that later on. He is the sovereign of the places in which we meet in order to reach peaceful agreements. His stasis position is in that wherever we might gather to make negotiations to keep frith between folks, between the folk, for whatever reason. It could be religious, it could be non-religious, or secular reasons. He is the presider of law, the internal ordering of the people to keep peace within each other. So he's our god of law.
All right. So you mentioned up front, because I don't think there is a ton of source material on it. Compare and contrast, if you would, for our audience, between Forseti and Tyr.
Well, somewhere along the way, there was kind of a titling on Tyr to be the god of justice, and I think they took that in modern sense, a little off the rails because of certain things. One, I think the symbology of the Tiwaz rune or the Tiu rune, and people kind of placing that with scales. And I think they ended up presiding over, or as being Tyr being the one that blesses over the all thing. And since the all thing was a gathering in which one of the primary functions of it was legality, a lot of folks, I think, took that to mean in some ways that he is a god of justice in law. And I don't think that was the case. I think the case of that is that Tyr is the justice of a nation. He is the outward expansion or justice of a nation as they move forward collectively. Forseti is law internalized. And so a lot of people get these two confused. They'll I need to go and I wish to, ask for guidance or aid in, a courtly manner as far as something that needs to be done. And I would like to give prayers and offerings to Tyr for justice in that courtroom, or in that, I guess, mitigation of things. And that's not directly accurate. If we're talking about the lawgiver, if we're talking about the law speaker of the gods, we're talking about Forseti. And his sovereignty is about smoothing things out in between. So there's I think that's where the confusion comes from a lot.
I think it's worth mentioning that Forseti's name means presider or president of things, whereas, and not president. So, I mean, I suppose it does mean president in a modern sense, but president in an original sense as the one who presides over an assembly or presides over an organization. And I think that just comparing them in a scale way, it's interesting to compare Forseti to Tyr, whose name means God. And, ultimately God of the bright sky. When thinking about things, I think it's also worthwhile for our folk to consider that there's multiple ways to address a grievance. When you're dealing with people in your inner yard and you want to talk it out and find an equitable compromise or work it out in some kind of way that's going to yield peace between people, that's going to literally reconcile men, that's much more the domain of Forseti. When you want to reconcile the fate of nations through combat, then I think that those things are more justice as adjudicated by Tyr. And I think that flows with Tyr being our war god as well. It's, if you want to, the justice of nations and races and cosmic things is the domain of Tyr, that divine balance through bloodshed, through conflict, whereas Forseti is settling interpersonal things through peace. And it talks in the Eddas about how Tyr is not a reconciler of men, whereas Forseti is.
Right. But ultimately, you just hit the nail on the head. It's the reconciliation of fate. Both can apply to them. It's just in different ways, through combat or through, peaceful means of law and maintaining, corporal law of the people, however they, might seem to deem it fit. Because when we talk about Forseti, that's one of the other interesting things about him as far as, say, historical lore. And I'm excluding personal devotion to Forseti and things of that nature. On a lore sense, he's one of the gods that we have really bright details about outside of the Nordic realm that are perfectly parallel, and basically they're not explained in the Eddas that there is this parallel, but when you see the lore that's based out of Holland and Phrygia in specifics, it becomes apparent that there's a lot of information about the dedication to Forseti outside of just the Nordic realm. And I think that's
Absolutely.
one of the most interesting things.
Okay, so for people who are unfamiliar, can you tell that story?
Yes. So there is an island northwest of Holland, and it is still there. I believe it's called Helgoland now.
Nick, can you throw us up a map with that island indicated?
So yeah, off the northwest coast of Holland, there is a small island. It's close towards Denmark. And this island is actually very specifically mentioned in the story. Though it is believed that the story might be older, most people think it originates from the time in which Charlemagne was trying to utilize his, force, money, property, and marriage rights to convert the Germanic folk into Christianity. And this story seems to originate from there, but there are many people that believe it might be older because there's some numerics involved there, but it's not 100% sure. But basically, the story goes that Charlemagne comes to the land of the Frisians and says, gather your 12 law speakers, bring them here, and I want to hear the law. And each one of the law speakers, according to the story, had different laws for their areas. And so none of it was consistent and none of it was the same. And so he said, you guys are, of no good. And so he put them in a boat, pushed them off into the ocean with no rudder and no oars. And so the 12 men were doomed to go out into the stormy seas. And it was at that point where they look at the back of the boat and there's a 13th man, and he is carrying a golden axe. It's never described exactly how that axe looks. The axe he uses as a rudder, and he guides the ship to the island. And then he walks up onto the shore and he throws the axe. And the axe in Dutch is called the axe mound on the island. And he throws the axe onto the island, and a spring comes forth from the strike where he throws the axe. And then at that sacred spring, he teaches all of the 12 chieftains of the Frisians a singular law. And he is known as Forseti. So it's slightly different in the spelling, but it's pretty much gathered there that this is one of the rarest of occasions in which we have proof outside of the Nordic lands that a us intervened physically into these folks' lives and created the law of the Frisians. And so now the Frisians are seen as, much like the Swedes are of the Lord Froing or Frey, the Frisians are of Forseti. And so that's how the story goes. From there, that island was made sacred, and for the time that they were resisting all of this, usury and chicanery and even outright violence from the religion of Rome, they ended up holding on true to these traditions throughout. So that, I think, is truly interesting. They had remarks of men and women there that once they entered on the island, they had to remain silent. They tended to the island, and there was no killing of the animals on this island. Let me check my notes to see if I can find the name of the island, actually, because I believe it is Helgoland, which is Halgo. Helgo. Let's see here. The name is Axenthau, is the name of the axe mound that is on the island. Most people have taken the axe to be a golden axe, sometimes double-sided, sometimes single-sided. And there is actually reference to Forseti's Grove in Norway as well. Forsetalundur is, again, associated. I can't find the name of the island currently right now, as it is called today. Yes, but that's the interesting thing about it. The Frisians suffered a lot during that time period, and they also enacted a fair amount of justice on the invader religion. That is also the place where Boniface, the monk that with his well-armed retinue, even though he's often the one that's given, praise as cutting the oak down. He was with a well-armed contingent, and he was supposedly had cut the oak of Donner down, and it was the Frisians that later caught up with him many years later, and they never forgot that. Let's just put it that way.
So, as a point of interest, the island is Heligoland.
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 I knew I was going to butcher it. And this island is real, and they have statues to Forseti on some of the land outside of that, across the way. I was given kind of some insight about that area. It used to be. I have a friend who's from Holland, and he said that the northern area used to be far more flooded with water. So when they built the dams on the northern side, they ended up utilizing a lot of the land there, but it used to be far more reaching of water. So that trip to the island was much more daunting than it looks today.
All right. Well, so far we have 0 questions in the question section. So it's going to be up to us to fill some space, and I'm sure that we can accomplish that. Teddy did ask a question. It hasn't popped up in my question section, but he says, does the word charlatan come from Charlemagne? It does not. Charlatan comes from, I believe, a Spanish word meaning someone who talks indiscreetly or talks over much, someone who babbles, whereas Charlemagne comes from Karl the Great, which comes from the Germanic word Karl, meaning a free man.
Free man.
So those two are etymologically different.
Yeah, Charlemagne, like it says, spelled Magna, the Great. That's why it's spelled oddly.
In Latin, Carlos Magnus.
Carlos Magnus.
Or in German, Karl de Grosse. So interesting stuff. I don't know if our fans like it or not, but we're going to keep doing it. We're going to do our episodes on our heroes because it's important. But as a point of interest, last week we had our first episode on the heroes of our folk. We did Raud the Strong, and there was exactly 0 questions generated about Raud the Strong or his life. And I know Mike had prepared a lot of stuff. I think it was good we talked about him, but folks didn't have a lot of questions. So I think we're going to have to do a lot more storytelling on some of these things. I think we're, a year into not a year, but July, like 8 months into this. I think the questions are going to dry up a little bit compared to what they once were.
Well, and I wonder too if new people to Asatru are still trying to acclimate to understanding divinity, acclimating to understand cosmos, acclimating to understand morals, and so understanding the heroes ends up becoming further down the list. I wonder about that if that's the case, or perhaps a lot of people already know, and I think it'd be quite interesting when we get to like say. Maestro Guido von List or Alexander Rudd Mills, and there might be some more interesting questions there.
We'll see, but I'm excited about doing those, and I think it's going to give a chance to some other folks we haven't heard from to get on talk to our video Victory Never Sleeps audience. Hold on a second. I got a sneeze that's trying to come.
Oh.
There we go. Apologize about that, guys. Excuse me. All right, we got a couple of questions coming up. We've got our question from the King of Cheese. Svan, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Extremely sore. The gym is catching up to me, if you will. So I feel like a rickety wicker basket filled with beef jerky.
There you have it. Tony, I feel great too. I look forward to these. They're awesome. It's kind of a broken record, but couple anecdotes, I suppose. Svan mentioned his gym soreness. I got to tell you, my joints have been killing me since I hit 40. I hit 40, and it's like the day I hit 40, everything betrayed me. So always working through something. My jujitsu is not helping on my joints. But I'm going to push through till I get that black belt. I think I'm getting close. But I got that going on. Also, as a random side note, stomach stuff. I just started drinking kefir from time to time, and I have noticed whenever I have any kind of an upset stomach, the second any kind of yogurt or kefir touches my stomach, the entire thing changes and it feels good. So, not that was asked about, but that's my Matt recommendation if you got any tummy troubles.
Yeah, we are currently working on a yogurt strand and and sources of probiotics to make kefir. That is a life changer right there as far as just everything gut health, if you will.
Agreed. Bruce asks, Matt and Svan, how was your Ostara? Svan, how's your Ostara?
Ostara was great. It was amazing. That's a big one. I mean, everything from arrival, everyone was coming in, everyone was safe. So, thanks to the gods for that. But it started off with a boom, quite literally, as far as Thor's bloat goes. And obviously, this was conducted by you, Alzira. So always very powerful, but it's always amazing to rattle the Hoff with how many people are in there. Hearing the windows kind of rattle or just feeling that resonance in your chest from everyone kind of booming and galdering together. And then we did an interesting thing. I was not originally slotted to conduct it, but I ended up getting I was given the privilege to lead the morning dawn bloat to Ostara. And a lot of people had been traveling all day. So, the numbers are smaller in the morning. We only had about 10 or 11 attendees in the morning because most people were still, we were up all night and doing things. And and then the day proceeded on. The children were playing cube and looking for eggs. And there was a women's study group that was massive. And men were, firmly standing around cooking, barbecuing, and drinking beer and just chatting and talking, and it was a really good time. And then after, as the night settled in, we finished the day at sunset with a thankful bloat to Ostara. It was quite beautiful. And then big sumble, big auction, lots of amazing items, and always amazing items at the auctions. Those are like the highlight. And then then it was just beautiful to kind of ease out in the morning on Sunday morning with a Wayfarer's bloat. Everybody was dressed relaxed and having a good time and saying goodbyes and having to kind of go our separate ways again. So it was a beautiful Ostara. I loved it.
Yeah, I told you guys last week about my experiences at our national Ostara at Thorshof, and it was great. It was a really great event. Just here locally, it fell on the actual equinox fell on a weekday, but wife took it off of work, and we spent the day doing some cool stuff as a family. It was really nice because my daughter is getting to the age where she can, she can participate more and figure stuff out. And so she was really excited going on an egg hunt and finding the eggs that we had, I think hid is a strong word. I think placed in relatively plain sight around the house. But she was excited about that, and that was neat. She had a lot of fun with that, which was cool. Yeah, and I bought her an overpriced Paw Patrol themed basket from Walmart that was mislabeled, and I was greatly vexed when I got to the checkout, but I got it anyway because she's obsessed with the Paw Patrol. But yeah, Ostara was really nice. The weather out here in northern Nevada does not seem to realize that it is springtime. So we were having blizzard conditions as of earlier this afternoon, and still dealing with some winter weather that way. But everything's going good on our end, Ostara-wise. Our next question is from Sarah. Would Forseti be the god the Loksumather would call upon? Svan, when we get odd words, you are the guy we ask.
Yeah, well, I'm seeing Mother here, obviously Logsu or Losu. This looks like it might be Losu Mother. Is that an O with 2 dots over it? Maybe.
I don't know. I don't speak that, but
can you clarify on that one?
Perhaps.
Oh wait, are you talking about law, like a lawman?
I'm guessing that's what she might be talking about, but again,
100% yes. If you're talking about a lawman, like a lawman. It can't be emphasized enough. If we were to look at Asatru as, let's say, a defining point, or if we were to have we have our own town, we have our own state, or we have our own nation, or whatever it may be, absolutely 100% the equation to law, or the houses of law, the places in which law is established and set forth, the presiding symbol and the god that presides over those houses would be Forseti. So anybody connected to it, I think would take great benefit, because and it's interesting because when we talk about law, we're not talking about any particular nation's law. When we talk about, they had their own law. We know that the Icelanders had their own law. It was the act of law that he presides over, that it was incumbent upon us to take down that wisdom. I think that the reason of the story of Forseti coming forth physically in the boat is definitely correlated to the threat that was coming into the land by Charlemagne. But so that emphasis, I think, is painted there. But yes, if you are a lawman, if you're a paralegal, if you're a lawyer, it is, again, I would say, deeply, obligatory or obligational that you have to, at least give honorings and pious homage to Forseti. I think as a benefit, though, Forseti is called upon to give and to protect the sanctity of law within that place. And so Forseti would most certainly be correlated with any sort of sense of clarity, clarification, the pursuit of correctness, in all sense, the rectifying of wrongs, if you will. If people go against the natural law of the folk, this is the place in which they can be corrected, in order to make right and bring things back to alignment. So yes, 100%.
Next question. In some pantheons, they have a deity or god that helps them with court cases and stuff. How do you feel about Forseti helping out with that if you are a practicing Vitki?
That was interesting. At the at the end there. Vitki. If you're talking about in use with, say, like runes and willful manifestations of it, I mean, that was a very interesting end. I'll just say that much. 100%, yes. He's the. If we had a courtroom, that courtroom should have the golden axe and an image of Forseti, and all things presiding there would be of him. I think it's also very interesting to remember too who Forseti's parents are, because that makes a further explanation more, palatable, as understanding why Forseti is the god of law and the god of frith keeping in the courtrooms. As far as the Vitki goes, a lot of that resides on you. If you're a practitioner of those things, in which, for people that might not know, a Vitki is kind of like a wise man who uses or has the ability to willfully push desire into the things around him or her, and I don't know how much an ouse or an Ausenia will get involved in that. That's on them. So I think it relies more on you.
Well, it's a really interesting question. In court cases and stuff, yeah, absolutely. I think that's the god you should call on in your court cases. If you're a Vitki, if you're a farmer, if you're a fisher, if you're a homeless dude, if you're whatever you are, I think that's, the god to consult for legal matters. It raises a strange question because, what Svan said, certainly, but I think that the closest that most of us would translate Vitki to is wizard. If you are,
I said wise man, but yes.
Yeah, if you're going, you're going literal, I'm going colloquial. And I'm stumbling over this because it's an awkward thing to put into words. If you are putting your thumb on the scales with some hocus pocus, then I don't think invoking Forseti, if you're influencing the system out of bounds with your Vitki hocus pocus, I don't think that calling on Forseti would be appropriate. I think it would be counterproductive to what you're trying to do.
Right. That's what I was trying to say, but it's more on you if you're kind of pressing your finger on the scale or kind of pulling the strings in certain ways. But if you were to implore faith in Forseti, the idea would be perhaps the guidance towards great counsel. We have a lot of proof of names both in Anglo-Saxon and in Nordic that are deeply set on the word counsel. Eldred means counseled by the elders. Alfred means counseled by the elves. Harold Hardrada, his last name, even though it's often said as Hardrada, is Haurrada or Haurrada, stern or hard counsel. The idea that he was a stern counselor who wouldn't mince words. He would tell you exactly what you needed. There's all these names kind of referencing to counsel, and that shows how much that was important.
Something else I'd like to add, just while we're on the subjects of invoking gods for your wizardry, there is a impious and disrespectful tradition in a lot of magic to where they presume that they can summon gods and then order gods to do stuff. I think that it is always, first, not only is it impious and improper, but secondly, I think that it is shockingly foolhardy for you to assume that magical acumen is such that you can out spiritually arm wrestle a god into doing what you want them to do. I think that when you approach the gods in an impious way and you start making demands upon divinity, I think that's a very quick way to have very bad consequences very quickly. I think at best, our deities perhaps laugh at how silly that is. And I think at worst, it can get orders of magnitudes worse from that. Yeah, if that is part of the magical tradition, then that is wrongheaded and extremely presumptuous.
Yeah, that's why that last word really stuck out. I was like, oh, wait a minute.
But again, that's no reflection on the guy asking the question.
Right.
The last line threw a lot of what ifs. Well, if you meant this, if you meant that, if you meant whatever. And I think it was a good question. It got us talking about something interesting and going off on a kind of an interesting track there.
Yeah.
Next question, Svan and Matt. Would you relate feeling a connection to the symbols of the jester juggling a flaming 8-ball and dice to Loki worship?
Well, first thing I would say is feeling a connection to symbology in modern sense. I think that it doesn't equate to worship. There might be inclinations, but it's worth noting that our ancestors have long placed value in games of chance, dice. Tacitus marked on this greatly. He said that the Teutonic people were very, very given to, testing their luck on certain things, betting, whether it was horse fighting or, rolling dice or lots of chance. So the idea of taking your personal Hamingia and putting it to the test has long been, I think, a standing point in our people and in our faith. So, there's certainly that. The billiard ball, the 8-ball, that's more of a modern, I think, kind of symbol. The flames, there have been people that have tried to equate, I think, Loki to Loki, who he fights against in Utgard Loki's palace, and Loki is wildfire, and so there's always been kind of this connotation towards that. But no, I don't think that equates. When you see modern symbology, it could be inclinations driving, your I guess would be like subconscious context to the symbols, but I don't think it equates to that kind of worship at all. I wouldn't actually consider going down that road at all. The nature of Loki is very, I would think, best to say, and antithetical towards good chance of game and the things that keep the folk together in entertainment, like billiards or bowling or all of these games that originate from very far back into the past, were all originated for the folk to get together and have fun, and that's the way it should be. I don't think it kind of equates to that.
Yeah, I've got to say I'm not really familiar with that symbology. I don't know where those symbols are displayed, and without knowing who is displaying stuff, it's very hard. It's very hard to ascribe specific meanings if you're not familiar with where it's displayed. I see somebody over in the chat room talking about some juggalos. Is that some kind of a juggalo symbol, like the hatchet dude? I don't know. Again, I'm not familiar with the symbol. But one of the things that I will say.
Oh, tattoos. Somebody said tattoos. Sorry.
There's no. There's Loki worship wasn't a thing historically. Misguided people now say that they worship Loki, and I wonder what all that really means. What I find in most of those cases, and I will stipulate, we have enough people in the world doing odd things that I'm sure some people genuinely feel that they are worshiping Loki. What we most often see, though, is very similar to the Abrahamic idea of devil worship. Very few people worship the Christian devil. Most of the people that are intellectually minded involved in that movement aren't. They worship they define themselves by their contrarianism towards prevailing Christianity, and they symbolize that by worshiping that faith's, antithesis. Very few of them have a relationship with the Jewish Satan. That's not typically how that is. Most of that is edgelords that want to be edgy and different and define themselves by how not aligned with Christianity they are. And I think that we get that also in the realms of Asatru by people who want to champion forces of chaos or Loki or Fenrir or Jormungand or Surt or things like that. I think very often those people are not engaged in active worship of those forces as much as they're engaged in active trolling and edgelord behavior of people that want to live their life right. I don't know if that really goes to the question, but it does approach some of the Loki things that come around the periphery of our circle every now and again. Okay. 603. Although Forseti is one of the 12 leading gods, he is not significantly in any surviving myths. Could he be compared to the Teutonic god Forseti? Yes, he is one of the same, and we have been talking about that significantly at the beginning of the program. But
yeah,
yes,
I made mention of that.
They're the same. They're one and the same.
This brings up a good point too, though. There has been some I don't know, schools of thought where people will say it is Wotan different than Woden and Woden different than Odin, or because Woden is of the Anglo-Saxons and Wotan is of the Germans and Odin is of the Nords, that these are different gods. Yeah, that's crazy. But it's because of the linguistical differences. But yes, because the etymology of Forseti and Forseti have it's the same, the one who sets things before or sets things in precedent or sets things out like law, and then the one who also sits above or sits before the presiding council as a presider or a president. Yes, they are of the same. And it's not, I wouldn't say, because there are no foolish questions. It's just that I think that a lot of times when you go on the internet and you do research, you find this mentality amongst people who are not looking at this from from faith. They're looking at this from scholastics. They're trying to pick this apart.
And I don't fault that when you get it from Wikipedia. When you get it from a scholastic source, that's okay. That's what they're doing. I fault it when you're getting from folks that claim to be practitioners of that faith. And I've been long-winded on why I feel that way. But if you're a scholar doing raw scholastics, that ends up happening a lot. If you look these things up on Wikipedia, which we all do, it's a very quick, concise go-to for a lot of this information. And honestly, the further you go back, it's very often a very good source. When you deal with modern issues that are contentious in the overly politicized world that we live in, that's not always the case. But the further you go back on archaeology and things, very often it's a little bit better. But yes, short answer is we believe those are the same thing. So I used to be, there was a guy, and I'm trying to remember what his name was, but I believe he was out of Arizona. and or New Mexico maybe, and he was almost, he was suggesting the idea that the gods are different and there's multiple versions of them depending on the place they're worshipped in and all kinds of things that way. And I've seen similar concepts in a book I read that I can't recall the name of the author, but a very good book called The Ancient City, as if different Greek city-states had a different Zeus for each of the cities, as if they were different personalities. And I don't think that it works like that. I think that there are different reflections of deities shown to different peoples. And I think that the relationship that the Norse have to Forseti might differ from the relationship that the Continentals have to Forseti. And I think that especially when we get further afield to Celtic or Slavic or other reflections of Aryan divinity, we know the gods under different names and sometimes with overlapping lore and overlapping characteristics. And I think some of that comes to our relationships with people are different. So I know my mom from when I was a small child, being raised by her. I know her as my mother, and I know her in a very specific way. My grandparents knew my mother in a very different way. They knew her as a daughter, and they knew her as a child growing up, and as someone they were looking out for, and somebody that was under their protection. You know, my father knew my mother in a very different way. Her friends knew her in a different way. Her professional colleagues knew her in a different way. She was a teacher for 30 years. The students that she educated knew my mother in a very different way. Those are all reflections of the same woman, but each of us knew her in a different way and would tell different stories to express how we knew her. And I think that's the case with how our people who are spread out over the course of time and the course of geography have different understandings of our gods, because they know them based on a different relationship than others do. I hope that made some sense. We got a $5 donation from Michael. Hail Matt and Svan, hail the gods, hail our Volk 14 words. Thank you very much, Michael. We appreciate it. Svan, you were saying?
I was going to say, some of the points that you hit on kind of consecutively as we've been going through this, when we talked about the invocation question, we kind of brushed on the Loki question, and as you've been kind of bringing this up, it's hitting me because it's strange to see that there's like a linking between all of these, but there, the relationship that I think that a lot of folks have when you have those edgelords who are worshiping Loki because they need, it's again their antithesis mindset, or the religious groups, or I would say, like, you know, these kind of schools of thought in certain sects where they feel like they can call forth a god to do its bidding or their bidding. This is all really about, I think, a very strange relationship that our folk need to bridge the gap with about divinity. And I think that's one of the things that people who engage with us as the Asatru Folk Assembly, when they say, for instance, that they've been practicing Asatru and maybe come from other, like, more modern neo-pagan groups, they're not well set to understand a relationship with the divine that we have clarified as our way of doing things. This is our way. I think that's one big point that I'm just now seeing, kind of connecting with all of these kind of questions, is, you know, when people leave Christianity and they return back to the religion of their people, they still have either an old way of looking at divinity, or they have kind of a misaligned view of looking at divinity. And how you just were talking about, our relationships with the gods are very real, very tangible, and can be different based on the relationship. And I think a lot of people don't tackle those ideas very clearly. And I just wanted to bring that up. I think that's a great point. I think you've been hitting on them, but for the folks listening, to link all of those together is the deep underlining question of that is who are the gods? What are they? And how do we interact with them? And if you're invoking, if you're siding with, or pretending to side just because it's, edgy and cool with forces of, chaos or disruption or outlandishness, that's that the deep-seated root of that problem is the nature of engaging with the divine.
Well, on that, so we get, it's very easy to get carried away, and it's, I'm very easily offended by impiety. But I think that there is a difference between knowing better and being impious, and by folks just not knowing better. And I think that one of the challenges with our faith is we are in a stage in history where our people are, the default is impiety. The tagline that you want to, advertise something as if it's a good thing is it's irreverent. Like, irreverent is a positive moniker to describe whatever your product is now. And I think that doesn't require any more for me to say on that. That being a thing is twisted things around in such a way. I also think that our recent ancestors came into the world, into families and a system and a society to where Jesus is very real to them. And so their take on the faith that they were raised with or born into, their default setting was piety, because there was no point in their life that their God wasn't real to them. We're at a point now where so many of us have had to rediscover our gods and rebuild a relationship with gods that we don't start out with a default faith in. Most of us, and I think that the story is different for different people. So I hesitate to say most of us or all of us, but when I came to this, I didn't know our gods were real. I knew that something was, and I figured I would give this a shot and see. And over time, our gods became very real to me. And I couldn't imagine it being any other way now, other than to remember how it was when I didn't know that. I talk here a lot about how we'll get very well-meaning people that will join the AFA and, they will say they believe in the gods very strongly. But the coolest thing, and I've said this time and time again, this is a Gothi, when you can watch that moment that all of a sudden the gods became real to them. And, one of the ways to describe it, if you've ever been hunting, even if you're a seasoned hunter, and maybe if you're not if you're like a super awesome hunter, but if you're a recreational hunter or you've never been hunting and you go hunting, every dark spot is the animal you're hunting. Every little thing off in the distance. Oh, is that it? Is that it? I think it's a moose. I think it's a moose. Everything seems like it might be until you see the animal that you're hunting. And then how could you have been so foolish that all these other, this log over here was the moose? No, this moose is right. Until you see it and you experience it for yourself, expecting people to have a deep faith in something is, it's very difficult, and it's asking a lot. So I don't always think that the scholastic approach, which I know I'm very critical of, or some of these other things are intentional slights. I think it's a symptom of our people not having come to that sincere belief yet, in a visceral way. And, it's one of the things that Svan and myself work very hard to do is help connect our folk with our gods and our gods with our folk. And, sometimes our role in that is bigger than others. Ultimately, it's got to be people that are sincere, and the gods have to want to make that connection. And hopefully, if we do a very good job, and if we have earned favor and are worthy in the eyes of our folk and our gods, then hopefully we can help people make that connection.
And I really hope people are catching on to the depth of what you're saying, just in that like with Christianity, a lot of people, they say they believe, and again, that's held over with a very heavy caveat. If you don't, bad things, or so much of this kind of guilt and the yoking of it. Whereas we're coming from the legitimate point that you've been brought here, brought to the gods, brought to the folk assembly. We want you to know that they're real. But again, so I think that's something that's really deep that you just said, that I think people need to really get that extra layer of understanding is that it's a work in progress. It's something that you continue to do for. That's why the Gothar are there, to try to help, and that the ultimate goal is to make folks realize they are home. They are home. The walls are real. The roof is real. The firelight is real. The warmth is real. It's just, it takes time, and there's a lot of I guess, I don't know. I want to say deprogramming, but I think it's habitual tendencies that have a lot of people hung up on things.
I think for my parents' generation, there was a lot of deprogramming. I think for, our generation and those that have come, 10, 20 years after us, a lot of them are blank slates, or, starting out as atheists or at best agnostic. What I think is really special is we're raising a generation of people right now that start with that default, that the Hoffs are real. They've always had Hoffs, that of course the gods are real. They grew up knowing about the gods. Their parents have always worshiped the gods. We're seeing the first generations of those things. And that's very special. So things are definitely moving in the right direction. Our next question is, does the name Forseti, where does the name Forseti come from? What runes would be associated with Forseti? Now, we've talked a little bit about Forseti's etymology, but what runes do you feel would best be associated with Forseti?
That's a good question. My instant, the law speaker got me over Oster weekend. He said, I'm going to say something, and I want you to say the first thing that pops into your head. And I had no idea what was going on. I was in the middle of doing something, and then he asked me a question, and it popped. And I thought that was a truly genuine way of pulling things out. So the first rune that popped into my head was Rido, the riding rune. And a lot of people might wonder that, because if they're thinking about divinational explanations in books and things, they think of travel, but correct ordering and the setting into motion all of the things that are balanced, the polaric forces, the positive, the negative, the up, the down, everything has to be in order in order to move forward and upward. And that's the first rune that came into my head as far as, the correction of action.
I think that this is one of the special things about the runes. The runes function so much as lenses on how you want to view a subject, that you could make a case for, many of our runes having some relation, depending on how your mind works on it. And I don't think those are wrong answers. I think that as far as finding equilibrium and finding balance, I think Gabo, I think Dagaz are reasonable ones. I see over in the chat that someone thinks that Tiwaz is, and though we mentioned the polarity between Tyr and Forseti, I also think that right ordered upward pillar is a very good choice on that as well.
The guiding star too, throughout anything that obfuscates, seeing through
the North Star, absolutely, and I think that Rido also is appropriate. So I think that I think there's a lot of cases to be made there, but I think those are some good choices. Svan, I saw a video today by a Volkish
Let me scroll down. I wasn't following.
CH. I don't know what CH is a abbreviation.
Channel.
Vokish channel. Okay, on a vote by a Volkish channel, who said our ancestral version of a shaman is called a toverer, or toverer with the umlauts over the O. Have you heard this before? And is it connected to the word topher?
So Topher is is a surname, and I think it has. I'm not 100% sure on the front half, the TOU, but I think it means the latter half is Fari. It comes from the word Fari, like to travel or to fare forth. But I do know of the word like Tolver, and that's a German word, and it's an older German word, and it's almost synonymous with the Nordic word Galder, like a spell. Especially the modern usage of the word Galder in, like, say, Icelandic is understood as like a spoken spell, or a something that's being woven with words. And this again shows linguistics there. Even the word, like, I know a lot of people think of like warlock as some sort of like a male evil witch of like post Christianity, but the etymology of it is word locking, to lock things, or to lock down things with words, or sight. And so in this sense, I think it's not connected to the word Topher, and it does mean like a singer of songs or spells. And as far as in relation to, like, I guess what everyone would consider shamanism, and you said Volkish, and that would be why German, this is a German word. I think it's not modern German. I think it might be like low or like old middle. They got a lot of different classifications for German. But as far as, the idea of it being connected to shamanism, that would be interesting. I don't know. Most certainly connected to, runic Galder, again, being a Vitki, if you will. But in correlation perhaps to what would be, I think, more Sather style of trance, entering into trance and things like that, and communicating, or perhaps being a hub of communication of things unseen. I don't know if that directly correlates, but it does have the same sense as speaker of spells. So, yeah.
Shamanism is a tricky concept, and people have a lot of preconceived ideas about it one way or another. And one of the things is, it's tricky because the linguists took a very specific holy man of one faith or one people and have cross-applied it when they see similarities to universally. And so it's never a completely clean, like is to like. Like, I don't think that other faiths necessarily have quote unquote shaman that are the same as, Siberian steppe Mongol shaman. But I do think there's a lot of overlap in faiths, including ours, when it talks about trance work and dealing with things beyond the veil. But no, I've never heard of the linguistics that you just pointed out. I'm glad Svan was here to add on to that. Our next question, gentlemen, what goddess could be considered protector of the mothers? Or what goddess should mothers reach out more often for guidance? Frigg? Thanks. Frigg, certainly, but Svan, who else do you think mothers should reach out to specifically?
Well, yeah, definitely. Frigg is the first and the primary. She is our mother. She is the mystery holder of all that is motherhood. But perhaps guidance could come in a different sense. If it's protection, or protection, asking the Ausinir Hlin, who is a maiden of Frigg, is important. But let's say if you are talking specific guidance, I would say Var. It's spelled VOR, but there's 2 dots above the O, so it's an AU sound, Var, and she is the veiled one, the Asanya of insight and guidance, or premonition, inclination, perhaps flash of guidance. She is often seen as the one that sees beyond things. If you're looking for good counsel, perhaps Saga, who is, again, we're talking about the Asenir, who are maidens of Fensaler, and they are deeply connected to Frigg. And oftentimes in my faith practice to Frigg, I will bring up the Ausenya and Frigg as well together. I oftentimes ask in that sense. The other thing is to give to Frigg is good, but it is good to ask her handmaiden now. Okay, it's spelled GNA with a dash over it, but it's pronounced now. And now is the carrier of messages. So if you're seeking guidance from Frigga, one of the things to do is to give gifts to now, asking that she beseech on your behalf to the All-Mother about things. So there's a couple of angles you could go with that on that one.
All right. This question is a Svan question. Are there any nods to Forseti in modern day law in places like the Icelandic thing?
So other than a title, I think there is a holding title of that, of Forseti being a legal title utilized. Like if we were to say a judge or a magistrate or something like that, I do believe there is an actual title in the government. But as far as directly to the Althing, I don't believe so. I don't think there's any iconography. I don't think there's any, statuary in front of any buildings and kind of connecting those the elder beliefs to the modern law. Not to my knowledge.
So isn't Svan in Icelandic? Doesn't Forseti equal president?
Yeah, it like to preside over. Yes.
Well, no, I mean as a title. So right now, I noticed, preparing for stuff, when you Google Forseti, it gives you Joe Biden and then a list of other presidents of other countries.
Right. Well, and it's like, the usage of the word prime minister, it's not a common usage word.
Okay.
But yes, it's like a presiding, a president, if you will. Like Iceland had, they have been involved in mitigations of peace between, like, during the Cold War. I remember it was a very big deal when Reagan came up there back in the 80s. And so, yeah, I think I could definitely see the manifestation of his power there in utilizing peace talks between nations and things like that. But outside of that, it's not a common, used word. I think most people just, especially in reference to anyone else, let's just say president, or I mean, oftentimes by name, because you could go right up to his house or her house back in the 80s if we were talking about during the Reagan time. But yeah, so it's not a common use, I think. But it's kind of a position of one presiding over.
All right, so we have a comical question, but a question nonetheless. Do juggalos need to come home? Juggalos need something. I was really surprised. I didn't know that was still a thing until this last, and I don't know why it came up, but until this last Feast of the Einherjar, I was driving through Texas and the conversation came up. Apparently that's still a thing. So I was unaware. They need something.
The only thing I know of is that there was a thing I remember seeing where they were being accused of, because whenever a large group of like white people congregate, people get, they immediately start decrying all kinds of bad things. So I think that I remember seeing this whole kind of tirade of juggalos, basically, admonishing that they're not racially aware. They're not trying to push for anything. They're just having a good time. And obviously, I mean, it's built around clown-faced rappers. These guys are folk, but they're clearly not.
I mean, yeah, they need to come home. They probably need to wash off significantly first. Probably need some cleansing rituals before we get Violent J and Shaggy Two Dope to come over.
I don't even know their names. Are they on a rap snack bag?
No, but that would probably be an amazing flavor. I think they're being persecuted, and they're not represented on the rap snacks. All right, so here's a question that is an interesting one to think about. Will our gods exist if we as a people cease to exist? Ooh. What are your thoughts on that, Svan?
Yes. I think, they existed before, and they would exist if that was the case. There is a correlative sense of understanding, though, that in Asatru, especially through our stories, that doesn't happen. That life and the will to live, we continue on. That the people that the gods, when we talk about our gods, we are their people, and we look at them, from ourselves, and not from anyone else's lenses. They are our gods. That puts into perspective the idea that the connection between the people that honor the gods, not just some other random people in the world, us, and our connection to them once all things come to head, and the life and the will to live will continue. So we don't cease to exist ever. But if that was the case, yes, the gods were here before us. So
yeah, it's a dark question to contemplate. There is certainly a symbiotic relationship in the gift cycle and the exchange of energy between us through worship and our gods through blessings to us. I think that would be a horrible outcome, and I think it would be a horrible outcome to our gods. I like to think that as the beings that created us, they could continue to create in a different way if us were to cease to exist. The logic of what we know of things that predate us says that, if they predated us, then they can post-date us as well. But that's us using this dimension mundane logic that who's to know the exact implication that has beyond the veil to our gods. I think it would be a devastating thing, certainly. I think one thing that we see that's similar to that, and folk have had different thoughts and opinions on this, our gods are empowered by our worship. I don't mean to say that's the only source of their power, but they are more powerful if more of us worship them better and more. So I wonder their state of health when all of our folk worship them versus in the last, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 years in some places when they have been devoid of temples and worship. I have to feel that they are strengthened in some way, that we have come home and that we are worshiping them again. And I think that strengthening will continue the more of us come home to our gods. I don't think that's the only factor in their power, but I do think it is a factor.
Yeah, the synchronizing of our faith and gift cycle and connecting to the holy tides of the year, it all is about that raido, that the riding room, getting everything into alignment. That breaks blockages.
It's one of the things. Does Thor need the little bit of you putting your heart on your hand to the horn to be powerful and do things? Probably not. But does all of us consistently doing that together ritually for decades now, does that matter to him? I think certainly. And it's not to say that he doesn't appreciate when the smallest individual does, but as far as, overall empowerment, is it statistically significant? Maybe not. But our ritual acts, we have to, and some of you may have different ideas about Immanuel Kant, but the idea of the categorical imperative of acting as if, is something right if everyone in every situation were to do that thing? Each of us individually are relatively small, but if all of us do the right thing and the right thing synchronized in the fashion of Raido, like Svan mentioned, that is powerful. Any of the big changes we want to see in the world affecting, our state or our nation or our race or our whatever, or even affecting the gods of our people, small actions that we do individually, if we all do them together, equal very big actions. And I think that's a truth that transcends beyond the veil.
That's actually a great point to bring up, something that you had mentioned earlier this week. That synchronization of us all doing it together comes through clarity. So like that question about Forseti and Forseti, and the usage of words, and somebody had brought up the usage of Old Norse and the clarification that our church uses. And then you had brought up the reasoning behind this is for all of us to be focused in clarity, not confusion. Yes, people understand that there is Wotan and Woden, but here in America, if you say Odin or Odin, people are going to know exactly what we're talking about. So clarity is part of that, us building together, making the flow of that much more clear.
Absolutely. How do we study? So this question from Jennifer and Justin Young: how do we study things beyond the veil? Is there a way to use the runes? It's kind of a broad question. Svan, what would you say to that?
Well, I think when we talk about, I think she's referring to when I was talking about the holy goddess Var and seeing things beyond normal sight, because that has two meanings in our culture. Speaking about beyond the veil could also mean beyond death, but I think that's in reference to the sight beyond. Yes, there's lots of books and subjects on that in which we could go into the, I think that people new to the faith don't understand. So the runes are utilized often in faith, but when we talk about seeing beyond the veil, this could apply to, knowledge that's been passed on, even gifts that you perhaps were born with. Again, there are a lot of ideas about the way that our minds could be brought about to see more, to be aware more. And in usage of the runes, yes, there's the runes both internally to help you see. I would say yes, the runes, and there's again lots of ideas and thoughts on that. Lots of corpus of lore to study there, to utilize the runes to see beyond the veil or to see beyond things. But it doesn't always have to manifest in the runes. And the runes are, when you talk about, like when we mentioned the Vitkis and things like that, those aren't, I would say, the core of our faith at all. Like that's more something that I think certain people might be interested in. And that kind of stuff is stuff that was, I think, culturally seen as on on the edges of things. I think our ancestors had the meat and potatoes of the community were built around faith, family, and togetherness as a people. But when you go into looking beyond certain things, yes, some people do use the runes, but that's not the only thing. There are people like spaumaders that, or spaukonas that have the ability to see beyond, perhaps through water, or there's lots of different things, dream interpretations. There's a lot of interesting stuff there. Even today, my family had a pretty haunting encounter with a spaumader, or a man who could see beyond things, in relation to an injury of one of my family members. And he was in Iceland describing the hospital room that the family member was in, and was basically coming to say, I think that everything is going to be well from what I can see. He was clearly seeing beyond the veil. It kind of shocked a lot of us being here in the States, but it wasn't used by the runes. There were no runes involved in that. So sometimes it's a gift. Sometimes it's something that you work at opening and being aware of, opening your awareness. But yeah, the runes can definitely help.
Yeah, it's such a complex question because many of the things we do involve piercing that veil in some way, even if it's just simply participating in bloat and making offerings that transcend and go beyond the veil to the gods, and from the gods to us. If it's prayers interacting with your ancestors, if it's through meditation work, somebody said in the thing, mushrooms. I'm not advocating that practice, but that is a way that people try to transcend the veil as well.
Got to be careful with that.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways. Svan mentioned, scrying or things in water or in other mediums that way. Looking at the runes, I mentioned earlier, the runes are lenses. If that's your way of doing things, certainly runic divination is transmitting messages from beyond the veil. So yeah, I think there's a lot of ways to do that, depending on what you want to do, and the specifics matter there. But yes, runes can be helpful in that practice, as can many other things. Next question is coming in late. How was Ostara, and also how is Sigerheim going as of now? So updates, talked about a little bit at the top of the program, but Ostara was awesome. Ostara at Thorshof was absolutely amazing. As far as I've heard, Ostara's at all of our Hofs were really good. The Ostara at Baldershof was difficult because the weather there was not cooperative, so a lot of roads in Minnesota were closed off. But yeah, the national event Ostara at Thorshof was fantastic this year. As far as how things are going with Sigerheim, things are going great. We should have 2 or 3 people living in non-permanent structures on the site this time next month. We are currently contacting different lawyers as far as helping us with ownership agreements and bylaws and anything necessary as far as the legal framework of the intentional community there. Had a guy out there last weekend taking measurements and talking to a sewage guy. So we're moving forward on that, and be aware we are going to have an event there in July, Sigerbloat at Sigerheim. It's going to be the annual event at Sigerheim, continuing certainly when we get a Hof and when we get a hall there, but rather rustic until then. But we're gonna do that starting this year. Can you please talk a little more about Saga? Witan Callahan gave a great informal talk at Baldershof Yule, and I'm very interested but struggling to find more info. Svan, can you tell folks what you know about Saga?
Yeah, Saga is the Ausenir. She's the maiden of Fensaler that we often her dominion, her throne, her power is in relation to memory. And that memory is usually in the application of story, but also kind of extended to genealogy. And so I think when you meet people and they have their own relationships, they see Saga as the memory reservoir of the gods. She's the accumulator of knowledge, or perhaps it would be more like, I guess, akin to the surface knowledge. There's deep knowledge, and then there's the knowledge that needs to be pulled up immediately pertaining to the situation. And that's why it's mentioned that Odin seeks Saga to recollect lore. And I think that I've always kind of, if you were to say, and I know we're using like legal talk, but it's like if you needed somebody to go and find and look up something that was pertinent to the moment, that I think is the relationship that Saga is to Odin and to the gods, as a kind of a reservoir of knowledge that brings forth pertaining moments or pertaining focus. She's in Grimness Mall. She's mentioned as being in Sokvabek. Sokvabek means the sunken benches, and that could have two meanings. One is that if the benches are sat upon, that they are laden with guests, and that could correlate to a hall. Like that would be a good title for a hall, is a place in which the benches are always full. But it more likely has connection to the watery aspect, the mist and the water of the fens, because they're referred to as the maidens of Fensaler, the halls that are in the shining fens, or the marshland. So marshes are often connected to Frigg and to the maidens. It's kind of like, again, the place between the air, the earth, and the water. I guess the essence of her in relation to most folks is that she is seen as the historian of things, and history has become a huge thing within the Asatru folk assembly. Every Hoff has a historian, and again, Witan Callahan is spearheading a lot of that. So her bringing up Saga is kind of, again, in relation to that. So any sense of keeping note, log, diary, story, connection of genealogy, always about the looking back and attaining that knowledge, is deeply connected to Saga. So much so that the organization of knowledge is just as important. Being able to bring it forth, applicating it in the current situation. So yes, Saga is definitely the goddess of deep-minded, long memory. I would say one of the best things to do is to take on the task of genealogy and utilize that as a devotional act, dedicated to her. As if like someone was to go to the gym and say, I'm working out, I'm getting better, I'm getting stronger, and I do this in the glory of the gods, and I do this in the glory of Thor, because I want to be stronger and I want to break through catharsis and through stagnation. It would be very much the same way with Saga. I want to deeply remember. I want to find the avenues. I want to search. I want to be relentless. I want to know the lines that come before me, and then I want to help others. That would be a great devotional act in and of itself. But it could take form in other ways as well. But yes, she's often seen as she has the ear of Odin. That's pretty. Every evening he shares a horn with her, and again, the story, the language is talking about how he's going there and pulling this knowledge that is applicable to the situation, current, so useful. It's not just tomes and tomes and tomes. It's focused. So that's something to consider as well with Saga.
You mentioned Witan Callahan in that a number of times. It is her birthday today. Happy birthday, Brandy. We hope that you are having a great day today. Next question. What's the position of the AFA on the practice of necromancy and related graveyard dark arts? considering that it's part of Sather and Galder. So this is I promise you, we're not trying to dodge any of these questions. It is hard to answer some of them where the details make so much of the difference. What is necromancy? It really depends on who you ask on what counts. Magic involving the dead. I think that conjures up images of, resurrecting a skeleton zombie army to fight for you. I think that's probably not what the AFA would think's okay. But the idea of outsetting or going and practicing in mound sitting amongst graves and trying to commune with the spirits of our ancestors or of our fallen loved ones, I think that's a beautiful thing that we certainly support. When you throw in dark arts as a descriptor, I mean, ghoulish gothic silliness isn't something we want to be a part of. But the idea of interacting with those that were alive and have passed beyond the veil is, something we all do very commonly. It is a seeking information from those who have passed isn't the lens that we think of it as, but going before your altar and praying to deceased loved ones and honoring them and asking to interact with them is a form of necromancy in the most strict sense of the word. Those things are certainly appropriate. In the lore, there's plenty of examples of those kind of things. There's plenty of, Odin summoning, summoning the vulva, summoning, talking in the rune songs about, I believe, the Tyr rune to speak to the hangman, and speak. Those are legitimate practices. I think that when you add dark arts to it to make it edgy, that's probably not something that we want to get behind and put on the postcards. But the idea of interacting with the dead is important. And I think it's a good time to throw in here that one thing that is empowering and special about eventually all of our Hofs, but specifically now about Odin's Hof, and in the future, and to a smaller degree or different degree at Thor's Hof, is we actually have the deceased on the property. At Thor's Hof, we have a man that was a Christian gentleman that passed somewhere around the 1900, but with the purchase of the property came his grave that was very poor condition by the Hof. Yeah. But we've restored it as best we can. We try to honor it. That's where I took the ritual mead when we did Sumbul and different things at Ostara to go out there and share some of that with Mr. Bethay, who lies out there. And having him on the property does empower it in a way. At Odin's Hof, we've got Adam and Becca who are with us out there, and their remains are in our graveyard there. And I always try to make a point of going over and giving them my regards when I go through there, and of sharing some of the mead from ritual and incorporating them as best we can into the things that we do. And I think having their remains with us strengthens the magic of that place. And a part of them is literally with us when we do our rituals and when we practice Asatru there at Odin's Hof. So I think in less spooky ways, a degree of necromancy is used a lot, even though that's probably not what most of us would term it as or think of it as. What say you, Svan?
Well, I definitely, you were kind of hitting them in the hitting those topics. Necromancy, I think, when we talk about it, is a lot of it was brought about post Christianity, when in regards to the idea of it being spooky or dark art stuff, and a lot of that was about ancestral worship, repression, trying to keep that out of the folk. And it didn't really work, because even staunchly Christian populace, like even the tombs under Paris, ancestor worship and the building of shrines to the dead, long been connected to our people. But I think the spooky factor really was pressed because, again, Christianity by way of Saul of Tarsus and all of that they have very, very strict rules about communication with the dead. And when we talk about Odin and we talk about lore, and you hit that as well, that is contexting the power of Odin, and of course to even the sense of like spookiness or power or not to be trifled with sense of Odin. And so I think our ancestors, when they heard these poems and heard the stories, they that was the context they were taking it in. But when you look at, and I wanted to bring this up, is there's this line after Christianity in Iceland, when you're talking about the Galdrabok, when you're talking about a lot of like the Rauðabok or the Svartabok of Svan the Black in Iceland, that was post Christianity, and a lot of that had some admixtures of like medieval kind of logics behind that. So there was some really dark and odd stuff that came out after that time. I'm speaking of like most people might even know about, and please look it up at your own risk, but in Galdrabok they talk about the dead man's pants, if you will, and a lot of that stuff came post Christianity, and a lot of people don't realize like the Veivisir, the compass symbol and the helm of awe came from that time. Now, a lot of runic knowledge did pass up from that time in the past, but there was also a lot of layering of things that weren't necessarily Nordic or Germanic. And so I think when you see a lot of this like manipulation of the dead, that I don't think our ancestors were into. The idea was, when Odin talks about the hanged man, he's talking about like a criminal or a crossroad body. That person was there probably not for the best of reasons. The vulva, deep seated in the darkest places outside of time, and he needs desperation in that. So it's that those are very poignant things. But when we talk about like seeing our ancestors in the mounds, or if a woman tells her her husband to be, or her new husband, to go to the mound of her father and to retain the sword of her father so that he can go forth and become a conqueror or build his kingdom. That type of communication to the dead I don't think it's built on that kind of nefariousness. It was seen more as like an ancestral linkage. So, Utsitting, that's graveyard arts, clearly, but it's done in reverence. It's done in respect, in the sense, going out there and laying upon the mound to be inspired by those who came before us, to connect ourselves to the flows of those who came before us. So ancestor worship versus necromancy, dun dun dun, is kind of a thing I think that needs to be clarified.
Okay. So this one's from Nick. Many of our folk, especially some of the young men, focus too much thought and effort and worry and conspiracy on politics and on the other. As Svan said earlier, the lore and myths show and say that we as a folk will survive. Can we make a concerted effort as a folk to focus more of our attention and efforts on the gods and on our faith, and maybe stop worrying near as much? 1000% yes. It's hard. I get it. There's things involved there. When I think that our young men are more prone to it than everyone else. And I think that we live in a world where there is an increasing, at a very rapid pace, alienation of our folk from our tradition. It's very easy to get caught up in that. The other thing is, when you finally find a group of people that think like you, and that finally, the whole world's gone crazy, but this other group of people, they think like me, there is this tendency, and I think we've all done this, to where you just vomit up all of the possible things you've been holding inside that you want to say to somebody else who gets it. And it can be very overwhelming for the audience that maybe is not in that spot. I think that we shouldn't be ignorant to the things that go on around us, but the nonstop drumbeat every single day in our circle of what everybody else does that we don't like, and everything that's broken, and all of these things, and all the conspiracies, and all the doom, and all the gloom, and it builds up. It builds up in a very malignant way that is terrible. And in the meantime, it doesn't accomplish anything. What we are far, far, far better served doing is being aware of the things that go on that we don't like and not engaging in those things, but also spending our time building the things that we do like. We become so focused about how everybody who's not us is doing everything wrong that we spend too little time focused on what are we doing, and are we doing the right things, and are we doing enough things? You only have so much energy mentally and otherwise to spend over the course of your day. And when so much of it is spent on negativity that's in some ways masturbatory and in other ways masochistic, you're just flagellating yourself over and over again with unpleasantness, and all that energy could be put towards building. And that's something that I'll say the AFA has really made a lot of strides in. When we stopped just focusing on all the stuff we don't like and really started doubling down on, yeah, but what can we do? We found a lot of cool stuff to do. We found enough stuff to do to get 4 Hoffs, and we're working on a 5th with a plan for a 6th. We got Sigerheim. We grow, we do things. We built a beautiful AFA family. We're having kids. We're doing amazing things. There's a lot of stuff broken. We all get that, but there's a lot of stuff that we're doing that's amazing. And if we focused our attention, the more of us, if everyone in this conversation tonight took all of the energy that they focus in every day on, guess what new video we can watch of people that don't look like us doing something we don't like, and instead put that towards doing something we do like, I think we would be amazed at what we can accomplish together. You have thoughts on that, Svan?
Yeah, and I think you spoke very, very clearly and hit all that very well. I mean, I would say, you re-emphasizing to what you just said, there are a lot of folks that come into our community. They meet folk, and they're happy to talk about a lot of the dreadful and the dark and the gloom, because they haven't had anybody to talk to about it. And then they're kind of met at the same time with like, okay, so look at this room full of people, and we're happy, we're doing things, we're organized, we're honoring the gods, we're doing things. I think it throws people for a loop at first, or, oh, these people don't care. It's like, we're doing the proper usage of care is moving forward and upwards. So I wanted to, that was a good point that you hit there.
All right. Next, gentlemen, we are experiencing an awakening of our folk and people. At the same time, the degree of degeneracy in clown world is astonishing. Do you see a correlation? All Father guiding us forward? There's absolutely a correlation. And this is one of those things, is focusing on positive things. It is terrible that the world is spiraling into clown world as bad as it is, but it doing so is pushing so many traditionally minded, just regular folks outside of their comfort zone, that they are awakening to our gods. They are awakening to our faith. They're coming to the Asatru Folk Assembly. When things are comfort, it's very easy to grow stagnant when you're comfortable. When the times that we live in make things very uncomfortable for those of us of good conscience, it drives people towards action, towards doing, towards changing the paradigm that they're currently thinking about. towards awakening. And we're seeing that in a really beautiful way. And the two are absolutely correlated. And is the All Father guiding us forward? I certainly hope so. I believe that. I know that he is doing that in the form of the Asatru Folk Assembly and has been now for 54 years, and with amazing and beautiful results. Say you, Svan.
Absolutely. I mean, from Founder McNallen and his relationship with Odin and the clear mark of lighting the torch, placing the flag, or pointing in the direction, and then you also, again, repeatedly being guided, led, physically even acknowledged in the process, and seeing some of the things that I have seen. I believe it 100% that yes, and the All Father is dynamic. He moves. He is capable of the movement that is required to invigorate the souls of the folk across many lands, across borders and oceans, and oftentimes at the same time, people coming in like great waves to this inspiration. So yes, 100%.
Next question is, how did the AFA start? So, all right, the AFA, as it's currently formed, the Asatru Folk Assembly, started, depending on who you ask, and there's not like a specific date that we can find. So I always date it from the beginning of the year, from January 1, 1995. Basically, over that Yule, the decision was made to make it a thing, and it, so when you go back and you read the old runestone from the time, in the the winter issue that came out before that Yule talks about how the AFA is going to get started, and the spring issue of the next one out says how the AFA is now started. So sometime in that winter, the AFA started, and it was a coming together of a number of different things. So, and just as a point of interest, I posted a couple of videos about a month back now, I'd say, of an old VHS of a Midsummer bloat from 1994, and that was just a few months before, 6 months before the AFA was founded. And you can see kind of the state of where Asatru was at the time. So Steve McNallen, our founder, began his relationship with Odin in 1968. Shortly thereafter, in 72, he founded the Asatru Free Assembly. And then through various stops and starts and figuring stuff out over the course of the 70s and into the mid-late 80s, the Asatru Free Assembly established a lot of things that we still do today as far as ritual structure and things that we kind of take for granted, but they did those fundamental first steps in developing Asatru at the time. But there's a lot of infighting, there's a lot of squabbling over petty things. There is a lot of, follies that young men have, and didn't work out. And because of that, Steve closed shop on the Asatru Free Assembly in, I want to say 1987, I think, if not somewhere very close to that. And he kind of traveled the world and went about doing some of his own things for a while. Still very much Asatru, still very much in trough with the All Father, but seeing the world, experiencing some things, having a little bit of a dark night of the soul as far as introspection on things that worked, things that didn't work. A number of people carried on doing Asatru in the meantime. The Asatru Alliance did a lot of carryover of what the old AFA used to do. And the Ring of Troth was founded, and very, very quickly turned from a relatively folkish organization into a far leftist, extremist social justice cabal. That was the first period that there was any such concept as universalism. Before then, Asatru was always inherently folkish, but around 1990, the Ring of Troth decided to take a hard left, and that's when universalist Asatru kind of started. And so Steve, during the early 90s, he'd gone through a divorce in, I believe, the late 80s, right around 90 or so. He got together with his wife, Sheila, and they started reprinting or printing new copies of the Runestone early on in the 90s, I think in like 92 or so. And Steve started getting re-involved in the Asatru scene that he'd kind of left behind for a while and seeing the developments in that. And the folkish element wasn't developing very strongly or didn't grow as much as he would like to have seen. And this universalist heresy had really taken root in a lot of places. And there was a lot of confusion on this thing that he started. And so he really felt a need to get back involved and to reestablish the right way of doing Asatru. And so that's something that he and Sheila decided on and then got rolling in that winter between 94 and 95. And it started very slowly, and it took a while to gain momentum. But that's when and why the AFA and how the AFA started. Svan, can you speak about Idun's apples?
Yeah, well, I wanted to say too over here, Obsidian Skull had made a reference back to the idea that not dark as in nefarious, but dark as in just the aspects of talking about death and that stuff. And I think that there's some clarification that was brought by just saying that. So I appreciate that point being mentioned, that he wasn't talking about just like perhaps say evil, but the subjects that are kind of on the winter tiding side, the underneath, the dark and the shaded, beyond the veil of things. And yeah, that's an interesting point, because again, words, and you only have when you're typing, is when you say something like necromancy or vidki, like one little word can just throw that off into lots of different meanings. But I thought that was very interesting, seeing some of the chat going on over here. As far as Idun's apples, one of the truly beautiful things that I think about is that there is, when we talk about Pan-Aryanism, that's a word that a lot of people have been asking about. What does that even mean? And I think this is one of the greatest examples of it, because when we look at all branches of the Aryan folk, all over, from the source westward and southward and all over, there is the correlated power source of the gods. There is a sense or a source of that which the gods nourish themselves from, and it's often taken in the form of a power source or a pure source. Gold, light, youthfulness is always kind of associated with it. The light of it, of enlightenment and the opening of the mind. It's important to, for us, apples, again, that has a lot of connotations to our people and what that might mean. I know a lot of people try to connect Idun with Eden and apples to the Bible, but most likely the biblical stories were referring to a fruit, and that fruit most likely was like a pomegranate. The apple was added later with once Christianity was kind of embedded into Europe, because of the importance of what the apple is to us as a folk. So the usage of the apple as a symbol of that power, that nourishment that the gods contain, and then she is the threshold in which that power passes through, that the gods nourish themselves in continuance with it. That is an interesting topic, and I think you get a lot of different answers from people. But I would say purity, light, and order, that the apples symbolize natural law and cosmic order in capsulation. that the symbol of the apple, the golden apple, is that symbol of the encapsulation of all that is cosmic order and natural law. That once the gods attained that alignment with each other, once the Vanir and the Aesir became one, that encapsulation of that moment, that power that was from that moment, bringing them, clearing all obstructions, that power flow is represented in the apple. So, and Idun is the harbinger, because again, another pan-Aryan concept in all of our faiths, whether Hellenics or Slavics or Gaulish or whoever, the bestowment of that power and the keeping of that power in the feminine, that is then given to, well, it's given to the gods, but you can see it even in the imagery when you see Idun giving the apples to an ouse, in paintings. That image is very well clear, and I think it has a deep folk meaning, is that the bestowment of that power upon the masculine is a constant thing. When the horn with the mead is given, when the apple with the light and with the power of the imbuement of eternal is given, it's given so that then the gods can go out and willfully manifest in the world. So you see a lot of that too. So both of those, the apple itself and the source of nourishment of the eternal, and that it being threshold by a maiden, are both clear connections to you see this motif in the stories of all the Aryan folk. And so I would definitely say that's one of the ones that I bring up when we talk about our connectivity to our cousins or our brothers in the branches of all the folk faiths. You can see that happening over and over and over again. But it is my belief, that is the power, that conduit power that the gods received after they aligned.
You see that transcend beyond just, and this is part of Pan-Aryanism, you see that transcend paganism into Christianity in the form of the Grail and the Grail mythos, the idea of sipping the very sustenance of the divine, that which grants the immortality, which grants the godliness to the gods, being able to somehow have a sip of that, and sharing that in a form of communion.
Yeah, the ambrosia amongst the Hellenics, the cauldrons amongst the Gauls, the soma amongst the Vedics.
Exactly.
It's absolutely the interconnection of all of our folk.
Gentlemen, what information do we have about Slavic Perun? Looks like it's Thor minus the axe versus hammer description. But if you look closely at a Mjolnir pendant, it kind of looks like an axe head. Thanks. What say you, Svan?
Well, that's a cultural thing. Yeah. When, if the Slavics see, I've seen them also use a bow and arrow. That some of the imagery that I've looked up in my just researching some Slavic artwork, because I'm interested in art is one of the greatest forms of symbolic faith translation. The way the way you can see a people is the way they see and express the divine, and the symbology and imagery. That's how European. It changed the face of Christianity. When Christianity came into Europe, it didn't look like what it is perceived. After it came into Europe, there was a lot of change there. The usage of these things. So an axe, a bow, a hammer. I mean, and again, remembering too that Thor had the iron rod before Mjolnir, and of course too, there's correlation perhaps in the Bronze Age that there was the bronze-headed axe, especially they've been found in wells and at the bases of trees that are presumed possibly to be struck or grown from a place where lightning was struck, and those correlations to the oak. So again, oaks, Thor, Perun, there's heavy associations there. The striking implement. So I always call it the switch, the contact switch, whatever that form might be. The Slavs viewed it in their own way, and we view it in our way. But it's more important to understand that when we talk about Perun, I think in respect to the Slavs, seeing how they culturally see that contact switch of the striker is important, but our ways slightly different. And again, the dynamics of Perun to Veles, the god of the dead and magic, and their kind of I guess competing and antithesis in the Slavic religion is very interesting. I think it greatly influenced the poem of the Norse of Haurbard, where Thor and high beard or gray beard or the hoary beard ferryman across the water. I think there was a lot of influence there because you can see that same dynamic that's also placed within like Eastern Germanics and the Slavs in relation to the striker and the entity of death, if you will. And again, that's another like very loud pan-Aryan point is when the striker is he doesn't stop until death is involved. He doesn't step foot in the land of the dead. He's connected to the earth, and that's a huge thing amongst whether you're talking about the Vedics or Slavs or Hellenics. But as far as answering fully about Perun, that I have respect and I'm studying, but somebody that is of the Slavic folk faith would be a much better speaker on that. But from my observations of them as a people, I see there is. It's just it's their culture and our culture speaking of the same divine Aryan god of the sky and of thunder, the Stormfather.
So yes, your original thing looks like Thor, but with a different weapon. Yeah, same thing. I think it oversimplifies, but to avoid confusion, from an outsider's point of view who's not Slavic, yes, that's the take home. There's undoubtedly a deep well of really important mythology that comes through the Slavic understanding of Thor. And I don't mean to discount that, but yes, fundamentally, that is the same God worshipped in a slightly different way with a slightly different implement. At the end of the day, we need to understand that Mjolnir, or that axe, is a symbol and not a physical item. Thor exists on a plane that transcends that, and our myths talk about the great power of the strike of a hammer. So we envision it as a hammer. To the Slavs, that's the crushing, swing of an axe. To different folk, perhaps that's because all of that is the power of lightning. Lightning comes like a bolt. Perhaps it's like an arrow that's shot to great effect. The point is the striker god has the super immense power to strike with great might. And so we need to, it's not like we can go break into Thor's armory and see his hammer or his axe. And I don't mean to be silly, but I think it's worth reminding ourselves of that from time to time.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to say too, like another thing that would be a great point to look at is the Perun is often depicted as being in a chariot or being in a wheeled wagon of some sort. And then, of course, amongst the Gauls, Tyrannus carries a wheel as his symbol, the wheel that rolls. And then, of course, Thor is upon a chariot. So the rolling and the movement, Thor is often referred to as Einræði, the one who rides alone, or Hljóðræði, the one that rides upon high, or is a loud and cacophonous rider. These are all links between each other. So finding those commonalities between our branches is great. It's wonderful. But the symbology is more important than the literalism of it. It's just our cultural version, and they have theirs.
Or Oku Thor, the driving Thor.
Right.
Could we use Forseti as an example to keep our minds clear for our own judgments of situations, so we are not quick to act on emotional reflection or reactions? Can we learn through Forseti? Of course you can. We can absolutely learn from all of our gods. We can and should. I think that Forseti is a very good example to reflect on when you're in a position to make judgments and to deal with interpersonal relationships with other men. Certainly. But yeah, we should, of course we can. We should learn from all of our gods.
I made mention of this. Remember, I made mention of the parentage of Forseti. When we talk about Balder, the bold, the soul of the folk, the light, the nobleness, the attainment of that which is before us and above us, the connection between, and his movement from the above and below and back up again, those connections. Balder is the light of the folk soul, and Nanna is the devotion and the piety, the bestowment of faith. And so out of that comes the nobleness of right action and correct action and acting noble. So Forseti is the embodiment of those two factors coming together, bearing forth clarity in mind and clarity in the heart, clarity in spirit. So yeah, absolutely. I would say Forseti is kind of a personification of that.
Svan, can you tell folks about specifics about Hexanacht at Thorshof?
Yeah, absolutely. So that might be an interesting one. Hexanacht is coming up. So Hexanacht is ultimately, I would say, the basic way to cut it down is it is a blessing ceremony. A blessing by creating fire through friction, through spark, and in doing so, you bless the folk with smoke and herb from the fire. And I mean this in the sense that we have at Thorshof, we have a list of herbs, dried herbs, kind of like a spell. There's a list. In that list, you compile the herbs together, dry them, and place them in the fire to make the smoke sacred. So once the smoke is created, it is billowed over the folk as they pass through it, because they're entering into a time of the year in which, well, historically it was important to bless your menfolk, your children, and the flocks as they were heading out into the mountains or the valleys in order to graze, if you will. So the origin of that kind of comes from there. There's a deeper metaphysical point to it as well, though. There's chthonic forces of kind of chaos and the tearing away of the fabric of the folk, of the family, of the community that have often and numerous times are referenced in Nordic stories as the kind of the wolf riding Jotunist witches, the hags, these kind of degenerating forces of chthonic power, and they have the connection to the feminine in relation to kind of the drawing down and the tearing apart into the dissipation of the earth and the murkiness. So I think that's why the hag is kind of often seen that way. So the Night of the Witches from Thorshof and our usage of it is that we're blessing the folk against those forces, the hedge shadowed hags and dark forces out there. And it couples with the ceremony of creating a fire to bless your menfolk, to bless your children. And so usually the women are the ones that preside over the billowing of this smoke. And so we have taken it to, since we can't have all the women, just logistics, we usually choose 4 women who bear the color red, and that color red is symbolic of their power. Red is a dynamic color of power in our culture. So they don some sort of red, and they carry brooms, and the brooms are used to billow the smoke in a direction. So they take their bundles of herbs and they place them in the fire, and then they billow the fire with their brooms, and that pushes the smoke in a direction so that the folk can walk through it and receive their blessings over them. There's a lot of theories to this. Is like, one, it might have been of good use to do this, especially when going out into the fields with your flock and the menfolk, smelling like smoke, keeping predators at bay. There's a lot of poetic lore to the idea of there's the inner guard and the outer guard, or there's the inland and the outland. And the herdsman was going into the outland. He was going beyond the hedgerows. He was going beyond the confines of the controlled field to graze on new grass that was growing after Ostra, or after spring had started. So blessing the folk when they go out there, because they would stay out there for long periods of time. So this is kind of extended to not just the menfolk and the herds, or not just the menfolk and the young men who are, out there watching over the cattle and the sheep, but now it's presiding over the ideas. We go forth into summertime, and we go into working and testing those edges, going out beyond the inner lands. It's that blessing of our women, utilizing their, the herbs, the earth magic, the good magic, the healing magic, the protective essence of our women fighting against those destructive forces out there. Now, there's a lot of stuff when we talk about like Valsperganacht and Germany and the Balkan Mountain, and even Christianity with Saint Walburga and all of that. And that is an interesting thing to go into. But you asked specifically about Hexanacht at Thorshof, and that's the intention of Hexanacht that we do. That's the kind of the overall driving force of what we do when we celebrate Hexanacht. Now, for the longest time in Asatru, Hexanacht was seen as that ceremony, or that the night before May Day. And of course, May Day in the Gregorian calendar, being May 1st, is still utilized today because the Gregorian calendar is used a lot. But those connections came later. The overall point is the initial separation of those two was, them going out and setting the flocks out, to herd. And after they got established, they would leave people out there to watch over things and settle things. And then a lot of the folks came back. And again, sometimes, the young men come back and they celebrate. And so that's why you see a lot of the young men, young women connected to May Day. But May Day wasn't always just specifically on the 1st of May. And that does have connections to, the interactions between the Teutonic people and the Hellenic, or the Romans, the Romantic Empire. And so there's a lot of crossover there that's truly interesting as well. But for Hexanacht, we usually place it a good amount of time before May Day. And that's the intention of it, is to bless the folk as they are about to, start their new movement forward into the summertide.
All right. What are the views of Asatru when a person commits suicide? Like so many questions tonight, context is everything. So trying to think of where to start on that, because it's a big question, and I know that in other faiths, perhaps it's sinful, and in some it's sinful to the point where it would, prevent one from going to their heaven, or from being buried in consecrated ground and other things. It's not the case in Asatru, but I think that it bears, a little bit of reflection on, and I talked about this a little bit, I think last week and the week before, but times have been very rough for our people, especially for our young men recently. A staggering number of our veterans are taking their own lives. Since all of the reaction and lockdown towards COVID, we've had quite a number of people take their own lives. In the Asatru Folk Assembly, we've seen a number of suicides in the past few years. And it's devastating and really tough for those of us left behind. In Asatru, our deeds define us, but we're not. I mean, it depends on the scope of the bad deed, but most of the time it's an aggregate of your deeds combined that make the judgment on a person. So there's not if someone commits suicide, there's a hard no on something good happening for him in the afterlife. That's not one of our beliefs. But something that we do know to be true and that our Lord does speak of is it's better to be alive than not to be. However bad things are, while you're alive, you always have the opportunity to make that better, to alter that, to right those scales. Just like I said, that there's not, just one thing and you're damned, typically. When our gods judge you and your ancestors judge you, it is a complex layering of all the good and all the bad that you've done. While you are alive, you have the opportunity to continue to stack that well with good layers of good deeds and good things. Once you cash in your cards, you're done, and you lose that opportunity. You lose the opportunity and the potentiality of all the good that you could do. I mean, it's easy to have a generic response to suicide's bad, and it is, and it's very hurtful to the survivors. But in an Asatru specific context, that's what I would say in regards it. And again, there's gray area. There's people who are suffering from terminal diseases that are in humiliation and pain and want to go out on their own terms. There are people that throw themselves into the heat of a conflict because their sacrifice of life allows an objective to be achieved or other life to be saved. There are circumstances, but it's a very, very final solution to what are very often temporary problems. And I think that it bears saying on this while we're discussing it, not to be too grim. I think, I don't know if your question is out of any kind of a personal association or anything, but anybody listening to this, what I would ask is if that's something that you're ever contemplating, and this is not going out to the lady who asked the question, this is to everybody. If you ever get to a point where you're at that point, it's not going to hurt you to stick around for a little bit longer. And I would ask that you reach out to one of our Gothar and give us the opportunity to speak with you. Again, if that's what you've decided to do, then sticking around and having another conversation isn't really gonna hurt your timetable too bad. But it would mean the world to us if we got an opportunity to have that conversation and to try to dissuade you from doing that. But that's what our Goth are here for, and we're always listening. And sometimes when things are overwhelming in our own heads, to the point of making folks contemplate those kind of things, it would do a lot of good and save a lot of heartache to be able to talk to somebody who's a little bit removed from the situation, get those things out of just bouncing around in your own head, and then see what things look like on the other side of that before irreparable decisions are made. Do you have anything to add on that, Svan?
Not much. I the severity of that, I think, deserves just the clarity of your response right there is well enough.
All right. Poetic or prose edda? Yes. Yes is our official answer.
Yeah, I I think we were just talking about that, and Witan Callahan and I were talking about that, about the usage of all of translations, all the corpus of lore, to look at things broadly and to discuss and to speak to the Gothar and talk about interpretations, whether it's linguistical interpretations, whether it's spiritual, metaphysical, mythological. Yes, we do it all. We want it all. We want to be able to look at all of these things. I think that's
So
driving point of
it
ours.
just popped up in the chat. The lady who asked the question said the question was in fact a reference to a family member, and I just want to extend my condolences that you find yourself in that situation. That's terrible, and I'm sorry you're going through that. How would someone from the modern age gain ascension? And I think this is a very important question. Svan, what do you have on that?
Well, when we talk about ascension in quite a few ways, I think the first one that most people would be very familiar with is being chosen by Odin, and that ascension upwards, that ascension over the very bridge that the gods use to connect themselves to the middle, directly into the heart of the home of the gods in heaven. That ascension, I think most everyone is familiar with. And there's, does it happen if you just die in battle? Or, well, the Valfather is the choosing father. There's a big point about being chosen. But again, context is a lot. I think that when we speak about folk that pass on, and then their stories, their Haminya is still affecting the middle world, still affecting the actions and the minds and the hearts and the words of the folk. That also leads to an ascension, because it's worth remembering that Yggdrasil, the roots are connected to all the layers, and so there is a circulatory system of this movement. The roots are, of course, deeply symbolic, but we'll use the terminology there is a coming up. So there's an ability for the folk soul to ascend back up, and I think that happens by decree of the gods again, but also there's an organizational factor that happens once there is an ascension or a pulling up. Even after being in the middle world, again, because your Haminya and your effects of things are still affecting other folk. You ascend in title, you ascend in being, and the gods, I think, from there either bring you in to their abode, or sometimes, especially like in the ascension of the D-seer. Another great example that a lot of people don't think of is like, for instance, if there is a matron of the family that is deeply powerful and her Haminya has long been spoken of and affected the folk, her possibility of ascending up as a D-seer, going through the veil, passing through and being drawn back up and being placed in that spot in between the gods and mortal men, is where I think the D-seer and the Alvar preside themselves. So there's ascension in a lot of different ways or avenues. And I think that a lot of people do get that when we talk about soul ascension in Asatru, is that, the pieces of our souls have the ability to be placed in a strata that's beyond just simply going to a place where dead people go. It's not seen as that way. It's there's a reservoir of the folk soul, and there is also pinpoints of where we are ascended even after death. Yeah.
So this is kind of complex, and I think my answer may go a couple of different places, but I think it's an important concept. So fundamentally, a value that's at the core of Asatru is the idea of worth and measuring worth. We absolutely judge people. We judge people all the time, and you should. And apply worth to people. That's the very root of the word worship, is the applying of worth to someone. So how your community, how your family, the worth they place to your existence, and the worth that the gods put on your existence. Worth affects ascension fundamentally. We have developed some bad habits linguistically of calling people good. Like, oh, he's a good guy. A good guy means that he's not a jerk. Not a jerk doesn't equal good guy. There's actively bad, like you subtract from the value of the environment you are in. And then there's neutral, where a whole lot of people are that you don't really add or take away. We could take you, we could leave you, you don't, not great, but you're not hurting nothing. That doesn't make, you're not a good guy if that's where you find yourself. You are a good man or a good woman if your family is better because you are there, if your community is better because you exist, if your folk are better because you are part of it. So we need to often consider throughout life, are we worthy? Are we worthy of our position? Are we worthy people? What is our worth? We need to do actions and live in such a way to increase that worth. And the exact matrix of what allows you to ascend and what doesn't, there's a lot to interplay with that on whose judgment. But fundamentally, I think that it's worthwhile, and I think it's good to hold out hope that our gods make that judgment. First, going back and just not ascending, just passing on and going to your ancestors is not a terrible thing. It's not a terrible thing at all. It's a nice thing. It's where probably most people, what happens to most folks. Maybe there's the possibility of after that in your next existence of something happening where you ascend somewhere beyond the veil. There's so much of that that's such a mystery to us. But you asked specifically about ascension. Heroes ascend. Now there's big heroes with the big H, and there's little heroes who are like heroes of your family. Ascending to go with the Alfar or with the Disir because you're a special member of your family, that's a type of ascension. Ascending to where you get to go to one of the halls of the gods, to where you become something closer in essence to them, is another form of ascension. I know that what we're all very used to seeing is the Valhalla story of ascension through battlefield death. But it's very important that we don't try to limit our gods on what they can and can't do. They can invite whoever they want to their halls, based on whatever criteria they choose. That's certainly up to them. So I don't think that battlefield death is the only path to ascension. And I also think if you're inviting people to your halls, that it doesn't make a lot of logic sense that if you happen to be such an amazing warrior that you defeat all your foes and end up dying in bed because nobody can kill you, I don't think that really excludes you from ascension. I don't think logic bears that out at all. At some point, and I'm not claiming it works exactly like this. We don't know the extent of how gods think or what makes gods, but we know the bare minimum. And the bare minimum I think we always have to start with is, like we do with any other relationship, is empathy. If we assume that the gods are the very best versions of us, but at the very base level, they're at least the best versions of us, then we've got to assume that they make decisions based on values that they cherish and that they care about, not based on a mathematical rubric of who gets in and who doesn't. So they weigh and they measure folk for ascension. Now we talk about heroes. Heroes ascend, men ascend through overcoming and through mastery. Very often they ascend through mastery of themselves, or mastery of the situation, or mastery of others, mastery through combat prowess, mastery through excellence in a vocation or a skill set, mastery through overcoming their physical limitations or their mental limitations and transcending and becoming more. That's at the very root of masculine ascension. Whereas feminine ascension is through devotion and through motherhood and through being there, being that loyal support of things, being that stalwart that builds the family and births heroes. Female ascension occurs a lot through deep, deep devotion. So those kind of things elevate people towards hero status, and the heroes ascend. We also believe that the AFA heroes the Asatru heroes that in the AFA we've honored with Days of Remembrance, we believe all of those folk have ascended, and we celebrate them. One thing that we believe helps ascension is we believe in an idea of posthumous ascension. If we spread someone's fame to where it is resounding in the halls of the gods and in the other world because we have told the story so much and celebrated them so much, it ups their status. It ups their fame, and in essence, it ups their worth. If we can do great things in honor of or in the name of someone that we cherish, that we want to see ascend in the afterlife, there's carryover there. And so one thing we can do to loved ones who've passed is continue to speak their name, to sing their praises, to sing of their deeds, to do great things in their honor. Those things help that person to ascend on the other side. And those are some ideas about modern ascension. Next question is, if we explore our own personal relationship with the gods and travel to our ancestral lands, like our founder, Stephen McNallen, can we develop the same relationship with our gods? No, of course not. No relationship between any two people is ever the same. But by doing that, can you develop a very powerful relationship with your gods? Absolutely. But each of our relationships with our gods is going to take a very different form. Maybe by doing that, yours will be even greater than our founders. Maybe it'll just be very different. But I would encourage everyone to travel and try to connect themselves with the lands of their ancestors, with their history, with where they come from. And I think that's bound to help you have a much more powerful relationship with your gods, whoever you might be. Is the bestowment of power by women the reason why Idun is often depicted holding the basket of apples over the womb? What are your thoughts, Svan?
Yeah, well, we talked about the symbology there. Most of the paintings and pictures and things came, fairly on later, especially in the Romantic period. But yes, I think that is a deep inward folk expression of that imbuement is, whether we talk about it being natal or whether we talk about it being from the core or from the bosom or from the belly, the idea of the source, the core, the threshold. Yes, that symbology is there. Very poignant in bringing that up and seeing that. And that exactly is the kind of mindset that, should be encouraged and seen as, you see that and you should tell others. Or do you see this as well? Because that is where we see that cohesiveness of, I don't know, the inspiration of an age. I was watching over in the comments, somebody even had used the word zeitgeist. And yes, again, that's that expression 100%. I think you're absolutely right in noticing that as well.
So we have questions about the origins of the term Aryan. European scholars use the term Aryan to identify the Indo-European or Indo-Germanic peoples who settled throughout India, Persia, Europe, thousands of years earlier. Would we welcome these people into the AFA? So that's most often a very big hypothetical. On the term Aryan, yeah, those are our people that swept across Asia and Europe, conquering and developing civilization and doing amazing things. And the extent of that, well, I mean, you could argue that the extent of that in the modern age goes to, Australia, New Zealand, and the New World. But in olden times, as it were, the two extreme ends of that were Ireland and Iran, both of which words mean the land of the Aryans. So the question being, would we let Persians and Indians into the AFA? That's a big what if, and the imagery it conjures up is, makes people cringe, because I think we have a misunderstanding of what that means. The population of Aryans that went into Europe are made of the same people that had stayed in Europe. So you end up with white folks. The population that settled in India and in Iran, very, over the centuries, over the millennia, have been diluted by other populations and by the native populations of those areas to such a degree that they're no longer us. They're something different. In theory, if there was some high caste Indian that was hiding in some remote part of India that his people never intermixed with Dravidian people okay. But I think that that's highly, highly fanciful. Now, I think you find more enclaves similar to that in Iran, but our standard has always been in the AFA and continues to be, if you're white, if you look white, if you identify as a white man, and if other people who see you identify you as that, then you're our people. I'm not concerned with the migratory patterns of your ancestors as long as you are clearly like the rest of us. It's not the most satisfying answer to some folks asking the question, but it is the honest answer. I think you can look at Iranians and you can look at Jason Georgiani, that I think a lot of people may be familiar with, or you can look at the Iron Sheik, and I think that they're, two very different looking folks. So that's just something to think about. But yes, Aryan people, wherever they find themselves, if they look like the rest of us and are obviously the rest of us, can join the AFA and should join the AFA. I have a question. Is there... okay. If Kievan Rus was occupied by Old Norse, Finnish, and Slavs who traded with each other in the 9th to 13th centuries, who would have occupied that territory from 1 AD to 20 AD? It's a very specific question. Svan, do you have any insight on who would have lived in Kiev from 1 AD to 20 AD?
Well, we spoke about the Kievan Rus as far as their creating the structure of Kiev on the coast of the Black Sea, but that there were people before there. There was people when the Gutans moved into that area. There were people living there. They made mention of it, but they came in and they took over, and then they established in the same spot again, because Kiev is named after their influence from the Kievan Rus. But we do know that the Gutans, when they traveled from the Black Sea, they went over the southern land and entered into the Aegean Sea and attacked Athens, during their migration periods in the early times. This was one of the first of the noted migrations. They helped establish, but this was before the invasion of the Huns. The Gutanish people moved into those areas and noticed, and the Gutans were a conglomerate of tribes, much like the Alemanni or the Suebian nations. They moved in, and there were people living there. They integrated them, or they conquered them, removed them, sent them, running. A lot of times, the folks that, when they were leaving those areas because the Gutens moved in, they were the first ones to tell the Romans and the Greeks that what was going on up there. And then, of course, they got hit from the east by the Huns and were, for many years, brought under subjugation of the Huns. But were not seen as Huns. They were seen as Gutens that were kind of, again, the Eastern folk that had came in and did the very same thing the Gutens had done. These layers were all established in before the Kievan Rus came down from ultimately from Sweden, moving in eastward into Russia and then down and southward. So there's a lot of layering there, but there is, the Eastern Germanic folk that spoke the Gutenish language, and then the folk that were there before, and those folk, that's a lot of, the pre-ancestors to what we would call the Slavs. That was a huge intermixing time because the language, the writing systems, the architecture and stones and stuff, they show a huge blend of influence between the Germanic, Slavic, and even, again, Eastern Hunnic influences. And then even before that, the Scythians,
I would assume they were Thracians.
Yes, they're Thracians and Dacians or Dacians.
Yeah, prior to, in the first couple centuries AD. But it's very much a crossroads of many different points of conquest, but the vast majority of those are different branches of Aryan folk.
And it's even mentioned in the Bible that, the people above the most eastern side of Greece and into where it would be Thracians, they're mentioned as, having cattle, having iron, using chariots or wagons, eating a lot of dairy and beef. Even the Egyptians mentioned it, going all the way back that far, saying that the people above the area, like say, like the Levant, just above that, those people were most certainly folk of various branches. Again, and Scythia is like an interesting one. I saw a map recently where they as from a Roman perspective, they listed Scythia as being all the way far east into what would be now China. So, and that's interesting in the context of things, how they viewed the migrations of those people moving back and forth from the steppes. But there's a long list of layered people in that area, and all of them having connections, as folk.
So we got another question. What about Ascension in a more Greco-Roman sense? Heracles, Achilles, Perseus, Theseus. Is there some form of Asatru demigod? Sigurd comes to mind as one of the greats, but he doesn't seem to be regarded in the same manner of Heracles and his ilk. And what would make a modern hero fit amongst these ranks? Do our AFA heroes hold this regard? No, and I think that it's I'm trying to think of the right words for it. First, you mentioned demigods. Those heroes of Greco-Roman antiquity are all semi-divine and were semi-divine in their life. Heracles is the son of Zeus. All of those heroes you mentioned are relations to the gods in a very literal, very tangible way, and exist in a mythic time and a mythic place that the reality of their deeds that got them there are exalted and beyond historical examination. So it's very hard to take a modern person and compare them to Achilles. That's a difficult thing to do. The heroes that the AFA celebrates are all heroes of our faith specifically. And the other folks you mentioned are existing in a society where their devotion to their gods is a given, and they're not, they don't have to be overtly heroes of their church because the context of their relationship to their gods was inherent in the story. So in modern times, I think there's a lot of people that have the kind of heroic battlefield prowess that might put them amongst that echelon of hero, but it would certainly be looked at in a very different light because we have such a common history to go through. We can look at them in a very in a much more realistic light, as opposed to the light of great antiquity, to see their flaws up close, or to see the things of them that dim some of that shine that we can't parse through things about Perseus that might make somebody, make him have real characteristics that we don't like. It would be a much easier thing to do with a person that we knew in the modern age. Certainly there are great heroes and great warriors that are of that caliber. I think that, there are Medal of Honor winners that probably deserve that kind of exaltation. I'm sure there are Iron Cross recipients that deserve that kind of exaltation. There's people that have achieved that kind of battlefield prowess to be mentioned in amongst the likes of Achilles. But I think, unfortunately, there's such a big separation between those men of such an ancient past and modern people that we have so many historical details about. To compare them fairly in the same light, I think, is unfair. But that's part of why we're doing our series on our heroes, is to try to elevate that knowledge of them and that celebration of them. Our people have moved so far away from the cult of the hero that was such a beautiful standout of Greco-Roman paganism, that we need to bring some of that back in celebrating our great men and our great heroes. Maybe when we establish that cult and we're able to do that better, then some of our heroes will have names that ring with the same glory that Achilles does. What are your thoughts, Svan?
I mean, when we talk about heroes like Perseus and the forces being fought and the goals being attained of those heroes, I see that a lot in the same regards as we see with like Sigurd or Beowulf. But Heracles or Hercules is an interesting one because we see the grand mythos of Hercules going beyond mortality, and I would argue that there's aspects of the striker in Hercules that perhaps were shed by the Hellenics and then later adopted down into Hercules as a form that was seen as more acceptable in a demigod. But when you see connections of Hercules being this striker that's fighting these forces, he's clearly even beyond mortal in those regards. Yeah, I mean, there is an interesting point to be made when Frey sends Skirnir. Gareth asks him, "Are you a god? Are you an elf? Are you a man?" He says, "I am not. I am not." And so, one of the things I think that is important from the gods is that I would say the demigod aspect could also be either we've theorized or like debated and conversed about the idea of the focusing of the gods in avatar form when we talk about perhaps like shield sheafing, who's mentioned in Beowulf, being the personification or the focused energy of Frey, or and Skirnir also being that manifestation of focused sense of them. And that I think would be the closest thing I would see as a demigod, as a kind of like an emissary in between. So it's more of a top down as opposed to a bottom up kind of concept, I think, that differentiates our cultures. Heroes are from the middle up, And I would say like demigod by definition would be from the top down. You know, even arguing to like is Hermod, you know, he's listed as a son of Odin, but much like Skirnir, he's an avatar, a movement forward, going down the projecting himself, much like Skirnir, and the being like this emissary, if you will.
All right. So this is another question that we get a lot, but maybe there's some good recommendations for this guy. I want to study more books and learn. I'm in the process of getting the culture of the Teutons, and I have about finished McNallen's Asatru book. But are there any other books you would recommend I get? Yes, there's tons. I would recommend you get outside the prose and poetic Edda, which we talked about earlier. I would recommend you read Beowulf. Also, there's a book called Deep Ancestors that I always recommend and think is a really good choice. Svan, do you have any recommendations on books that this guy should get?
Yeah, I wanted to say it correctly. That's why I jumped over here to quickly look it up. Let me see. I'm just making sure I want to give the title correctly. Germanization of medieval Christianity is a good one. I think if you're looking at the lasting effects of Germanic and Teutonic spirituality that even survived past Christianity, but that's a more nuanced one. I don't know if that is the best, but let me see. I'm looking it up right now just to make sure I'm giving you the correct title. Okay. Here we are. Oh, it's not coming up. The myths and legends of ancient Europe. It has a kind of one-for-one connection between the Teutonic and the Celtic expressions of faith amongst the gods. It's myths and legends of I think it's myths and legends of pagan Europe. That one was a great book because it really did show some interconnections between the Teutonic people. Yeah, myths and symbols of pagan Europe. Early Scandinavian and Celtic religions. This is a great book that really does cover in little sections so that when you read this book, like ascendancy by heroism, funerary rites, the cult of the head, like the idea of in Germanic and Gallic culture, the idea of the head, the face, and what it might have represented in different aspects, like with the Gauls and their war trophies of head, but also like Thor's effigy, often being depicted as just the head with a glaring face. So there's a lot of really cool things, and it's easily digestible because topic by topic, small little sections. And it really gives great insight to some of the spiritual motivations of our ancestors. So I like to recommend that one because it's just fun to read. It's not dry, even though you would think. But yeah, it's H.R. Ellis Davidson, and I always, for some reason, get Davidson and Hollander jumbled up in my head. But that's why I wanted to make sure. Myths and Symbols in Pagan Europe. That's a good one.
Okay, so last question of the night, and this is something that comes up a lot, and it gets answered, but I know people have a lot of emotional ties to it. Interesting to what Alshiri Gothi said about if we look the same and identify as white, as I have blonde hair, green eyes, and to looks I am white, but I have 10% African in my DNA, along with a small percentage of Puerto Rican. And when I asked in a group chat, my soul would be ripped in two. Is this true? Here's the thing. I didn't just say, if you identify as being white, if you look white. I said, if you look like us, and if other people identify you as that. So it's important that other people see you as a white person and that you see yourself as that. But here's the thing is you don't. Following the chat over in the side, you obviously don't see yourself that way because you're asking the question, and you've asked the question, it sounds like, in a couple of different groups. You are very aware, and you in your mind are very much think that you're mostly white, but think that there's lots of you that's not. My example is, any of our people, very often in the United States, in the South, specifically in the Southeast, everybody's got some legend about having a Cherokee princess great-grandmother. Most of the time, that's not true, but it's a very common thing. And if it turned out to be true, that one Cherokee woman way back at some point, and you had no knowledge of it, that's not the biggest crisis. The biggest crisis is when we as a group have to deal with your conversation about how 10% Black you are and how Puerto Rican you are. That's part of the thing, isn't just about you, because one of the things in Asatru that's really important is the group and the effect that a member has on the group. When we evaluate letting somebody into the Asatru Folk Assembly or not, it's not just whether it's good for that individual to be there. It's whether it's good for the group if that individual is there. And if you're going to come in and the point is how other you are, then that breaks up what's very special that we have that you don't get to experience a lot of other places. The homogeneity of the Asatru Folk Assembly, being one people with a shared heritage and a shared commonality, is broken when someone comes in and their focus is on all of the things that make them separate and different. If you, again, I don't know you personally, but I have to say this as as an example, if you were not internally conflicted, if your soul were not pulled in multiple directions, and if you did not consider yourself not white, I don't think that you would be asking the question that you're asking. I think you wouldn't have brought up the percentage of African or the percentage of Puerto Rican. I think you would have, if you really, look and are as you say you are, then you would have just gone with that and it would have worked out fine. The second you bring up that other, that's when all of us then look at you as something other. And I do think that's a very real concern. So as a separate thing besides you as a specific study, and I hope that you didn't find that rude. It wasn't intended to be. But when you do have somebody of a very significantly mixed heritage, somebody who's, half Black and half white, I do think there's a very serious soul struggle there that goes on internally. Having nothing to do with membership in the Asatru Folk Assembly or not, just as a person, I think there's a tremendous struggle internally on where one belongs, what gods accept them, what gods don't, what they do, where does their soul go? How do all these things work? I think it's a tremendous conundrum that so many people do find themselves in this day and age. And unfortunately, I don't have a good, clean answer for it. The answer for it is I would advise those situations not occur before they exist. But once they do, it's a very serious thing. And I know that it's been a very difficult thing for a lot of folks who go through. Svan, do you have any thoughts on it? Svan, I think you're muted. I see your face, but I don't hear you.
Sorry. Yep, my clock was ringing in the background there. Just to reiterate what you were saying is that a lot of people in this day and age see themselves in individual sense, and they only see themselves in the individual sense. And I think that's people hyper focusing too on genetics and, I did this genetics test and it says I'm 1% sub-Saharan African and 3% Iberian, or I don't know. It's just the idea is that when they focus entirely only on the individual as who they are, they have a tendency to forget that what is going on before them when they encounter the folk assembly is that we are about our cohesion, about our connectiveness, our collectiveness together, our shared sense of who we are, our identity, why we choose the words we choose, is because these are words that we've named ourselves and haven't been named by others. I think we use the word white because it's culturally clarifying as far as in English and things like that. But when we say about Aryan or Teutonic or Germanic and things like that, that cohesion is something that when people come in as an individual, they are conflicting with themselves, and then they present that out, yes, to a cohesive group, that's going to make you an outsider, an outlander. And so yeah, just to emphasize what you were saying, is that a lot of people don't ever consider that point. Again, it's totally within reason that people engage everything from the individual perspective, but not seeing or understanding that when you come into, any group, if there was a person, again, like you had mentioned, who's like perhaps half black, half white, and they try to enter a cohesive group that's based off of, say, I don't know, being Afro-Caribbean or being African entirely, like Yoruban, Ghanaian, African, and you come in and say, well, I'm this and I'm that and this and that, that immediately it's like you're the individual highlighting things to a collective group, and they then that's lines are made because the collective group has a wall, has an edge, and I think a lot of people get shocked by that, but they don't see it that it can apply anywhere, and that every group has its ability to define those edges. Some groups are porous. Some groups are based off of your economic standard. It doesn't even matter your ethnicity or spiritual outlook. It could be economic. It could be regional. Like look at some of the Native American groups, where they're some reject other groups, and then other fellow Native American groups, and then others have like cohesion together, like up in the Northwest with like Lakota and Sioux and things like that. Everybody has their ability to define their collective edges and then maintain those. And so I think it's important, if folk come in, they are folk, they see themselves as folk, other people see them as folk. That's where they're starting to kind of break away from hyper individualization and understanding the collectiveness of the group and the tribe and the folk and the people. If we say, though they're Iranians, but if they look like folk, at what point are we spiraling? At the other sense too, is that a lot of times the answer that comes about is if there's somebody that's non-folk and they try to join the AFA, and there have been people that have tried to do that, the encouragement of them going and seeking their heritage, seeking their people, the way they look, the way they identify, the way they know when they see themselves in the mirror, they're not folk, they are what they are. They should go and seek that out. It's just not here. I think that shocks a lot of people, and people don't like that because we're in such a hyper individualized society.
But you mentioned that all these groups do it. So many groups do. I think that people are shocked because we're honest about what that we do it, and I think more honesty is better than less. But anyways, that's the last question we have for tonight. It's been a great show, Svan. Thank you so much for joining us once again. Folks, look forward to these shows. I know that that everybody is excited to have you on here. You're such a very knowledgeable source, and we appreciate having you on.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been fun. Wild ride.
All right, guys. Hope y'all have a great night. I look forward to seeing y'all again next week. Hail the gods, hail the folk, hail the AFA, and remember that victory never sleeps.